March 14, 1944. For the men of the 3rd Armored Division, what lay ahead was more than a simple crossing. It was a trial that would test the limits of engineering, courage, and sheer stubborn determination. The objective seemed almost absurd on paper. A fully loaded 30-ton Sherman tank, steel beast of Allied might, was to cross a rusted creaking barge that had seen better days during the last century, barely floating and threatening to give way at any moment. Yet the order had come from high command, and in war questions of practicality are often drowned by the imperative of necessity. Lieutenant Harris peered over the edge of the water, binoculars pressed tightly to his eyes. Noting the pock-marked hull of the barge, time had not been kind to it. The metal sides were peppered with corrosion, the wooden deck groaning under its own weight. He knew that a single misstep would spell disaster, not just for the machine but for the men aboard it. Yet Harris also knew the value of that crossing. Every Sherman delivered to the opposite bank represented more than firepower. It was a lifeline for infantry, pinned down by enemy artillery and machine guns. As dawn broke, the engineers arrived, their tools clinking the smell of grease and oil, mixing with the cold river mist. They inspected the barge from stem to stern topping, probing and marking weak points in red chalk. Sergeant Miller, the senior engineer, shook his head, muttering under his breath, "This thing's a coffin, Lieutenant 1 Sherman, maybe, but it's going to sing its death song. If we're not careful, Harris." Ever the pragmatist simply nodded. "Then we sing with it." The first Sherman rolled forward, its treads splashing shallow water along the riverbank, turning mud as it approached the barge. The crew inside, a mix of young soldiers barely 20 years old and seasoned veterans hardened by years of combat, held their breath. The deck shuddered under the tank's immense weight. Groaning like an ancient beast, awakened from its slumber, planks cracked, rivets popped, and a tremor ran through the hull that made the soldiers flinch. Every meter forward was a gamble, a silent negotiation with gravity and rust. The narrative of the crossing unfolded. With the tension of a thriller, engineers shouted instructions, directing the driver to adjust angles, shift weight, and ease forward slowly. The tank's engine roared in protest, pistons pounding rhythmically, as if aware of the precarious situation. Moments of near disaster were frequent. A plank splintered under the treads, sending splinters flying. A wave from the river struck the barge sideways, threatening to tip it. A sudden squeal of stressed metal echoed across the water, yet inch by inch. The Sherman advanced the riverbank, slowly creeping closer. Miller and his team were equally heroic. In their own right, they worked with ropes, makeshift braces, and sheer ingenuity, jamming steel beams under sagging sections of the deck, improvising counterweights, and coordinating every movement like a delicate ballet. Each man's heartbeat was mirrored in the thrum of the Sherman's engine, every groan of metal echoing their collective anxiety. It was as much a battle of nerves and creativity as it was a test of brute force. Across the river, enemy scouts might have laughed at the absurdity of the attempt. 30 tons of steel teetering on a decrepit barge, but that laughter would be premature by the time the Sherman's tracks reached the opposite bank, soaked with sweat and river spray. Every man aboard and ashore knew they had accomplished what should have been impossible. The crossing was a testament, not just to machinery or planning, but to human perseverance under extreme conditions. The crossing itself, however, was just the beginning. Each subsequent Sherman faced similar peril, and the soldiers developed a rhythm, a careful choreography of stress, calculation, and hope. Minor adjustments became critical lessons, shifting weight slightly forward, distributing cargo to maintain balance, timing movements with the river's currents. Every small victory against physics and entropy emboldened the men, fostering a camaraderie, forged in the crucible of improbable danger. By midday, half a dozen Shermans had crossed. The engineers, dripping sweat and smeared with grime, shared a silent acknowledgement of triumph, their eyes reflecting relief and disbelief. The rusted barge, though battered and scarred, had held firm, proving that ingenuity could extend. Even the weakest steel beyond expectation, in that moment, the seemingly impossible had become reality, not through luck, but through meticulous planning, courage, and the raw human will to succeed. When every logical calculation predicted failure, the afternoon sun had climbed higher, glinting off the steel treads of the Shermans. As they inched forward on the beleaguered barge, each vehicle's movement was accompanied by a chorus of creaking metal, snapping planks, and the occasional splash as water lapped over the side. Lieutenant Harris watched the second Sherman approach, Noting how the crew inside coordinated with the engineers, the shouted instructions and hand signals, the rusted hull beneath them vibrated with every rotation of the treads. A stark reminder that the margin between success and catastrophe was measured in inches and seconds. For the men inside the tanks, the weight of responsibility was immense. Not only were they entrusted with enormous machines, but their own lives hung in delicate balance, with the survival of the old barge beneath them. Sergeant Miller, standing ankle-deep in mud and water, barked orders to his team: steady, keep it aligned forward 2 feet, pause. Pause now, shift weight left. His voice was sharp, cutting through the roar of engines, the slap of water and the squeal of stressed timber. Every order was critical, every adjustment could mean the difference between a triumphal crossing and a disaster that would echo across command reports for weeks. The engineers moved like clockwork, pushing steel braces under weakened planks, adjusting the barges, temporary reinforcements, and improvising. With ropes and chains in their hands, even the most fragile materials became instruments of survival. Meanwhile, inside the Sherman, Private Daniels gripped with controls. With white-knuckled intensity, the engine's vibrations resonated through his body, and the groaning of the deck beneath him felt almost alive, as if the barge itself were protesting the weight of the armored behemoth. Every lurch of the hull sent a shudder through the tank, rattling instruments and shaking the crew. Daniels could feel the pulse of danger in every bolt. In every snapping plank, he adjusted the angle of the tread slightly, recalling the engineer's last instruction, and the tank inched forward another half-meter. It was painstakingly slow, nerve-wracking work, but speed was the enemy here. One wrong move, one sudden shift in the river could claim them all. By late afternoon, the crossing had evolved into a rhythm, a tense dance between steel, water, and human skill. Observing from the bank, Harris noted how each crew and tank approached the barge differently, adapting to slight variations in the rusted structure. Some planks sagged more heavily on one side, rivets had given way in unexpected places. The currents shifted unpredictably. Each Sherman became a test not just of engineering, but of nerve. The men had learned to read the subtle signs. A shudder meant a plank was near its limit. A squeal of metal signaled a rivet about to fail. A lurch indicated the barge's balance was off. Every observation informed the next movement. A continuous feedback loop of trial, adaptation, and cautious progress. The challenges were not limited to the barge alone. River currents threatened to destabilize the fragile crossing. At any moment, Harris had stationed lookouts upstream to monitor sudden shifts in water flow, and the engineers constantly adjusted counterweights and braces to compensate. Each time a wave struck the hull, the barge tilted, forcing the tank's crews to halt and recalibrate. The slightest misjudgment could send tons of armored steel crashing into the river, and yet, for all the danger, there was a poignant sense of exhilaration. The impossible had become tangible, and every successful foot of forward movement felt like a personal victory against the relentless forces of nature and rust. As dawn approached, shadows lengthened over the water, painting a surreal landscape of steel silhouettes and reflective ripples. The third Sherman, nearing the midpoint of the barge, encountered a particularly compromised section of the deck. A plank cracked loudly under the weight, sending a shiver through the structure. Private Daniels froze the tank, trembling beneath him. Engineer shouted instructions, improvising a temporary brace from a nearby steel beam. Harris's heart pounded every second, stretching interminably. As they worked to stabilize the deck, slowly, painstakingly, the Sherman advanced another meter and then another. Relief washed over the men as they realized the tank had survived. Yet another trial by nightfall. Half the Shermans had crossed the barge, battered but resilient board this gate half on vehicle. The engineers and soldiers, exhausted but unbroken, paused to assess the next phase. Harris looked over the darkened water, thinking about the cost of failure, about the precision and courage required to make such an operation possible. It was not just machinery that had carried the day, but human determination, intelligence, teamwork, and the quiet bravery that thrives in the face of extreme danger. The final crossing loomed, the largest Sherman of the lot, the one carrying critical supplies for the infantry. Pinned down by the river, every man involved understood that this last passage would test the barge to its absolute limit. Sergeant Miller adjusted braces, checked chains, and gave a curt nod to the tank crew. "All right, boys, this is it. Steady hands. Steady minds, one step at a time." The tank rolled forward, engine growling like a living beast, each meter forward an act of faith. Planks cracked, metal groaned, and the river seemed to hold its breath alongside them. The crossing stretched into the night, torches and lanterns illuminating the scene, reflecting in the anxious eyes of engineers and tank crews alike. In those moments, time seemed to slow, every heartbeat exaggerated. The impossible had become a reality inch by inch, meter by meter. By the time the Sherman reached the far bank, the river had claimed nothing but attention, leaving behind exhausted men, battered tanks, and a rusted barge that had earned its place in history. The night deepened, and with it came a strange stillness over the river, broken only by the occasional groan of the barge or the steady hum of the Sherman engines. Each movement felt magnified in the darkness, the slap of water against the hull, the rhythmic pounding of treads on wood, and the sharp voices of engineers, coordinating each precarious maneuver. Lieutenant Harris, standing on the bank with a lantern, casting long shadows across mud and steel, felt the weight of the operation, pressed down like a physical force. One misstep, one plank giving way, and the hundreds of tons of armor and human effort would plunge into the cold, unforgiving water below. The fourth Sherman approached the center of the barge, the section most weakened by repeated crossings. Planks that had grown under earlier tanks now splintered, further rivets loosened and warped. Wood threatened to buckle. Private Daniels, back of controls, could feel every subtle vibration. It was as if the barge itself were alive, protesting, challenging them to prove human ingenuity superior to the slow, relentless decay of steel and wood. Engineers worked frantically, jamming makeshift beams under the sagging deck, tying ropes across rusted support frames, and improvising in real time to prevent disaster. Every adjustment was a calculated risk, every breath a gamble. At one point, a sudden shift in the current caused the barge to lean sharply to the left. Gasps and shouts cut through the night air as everyone braced for the worst. The Sherman swayed violently, its tread struggling to maintain traction. Harris's heart raced. He could see the sweat running down the crew's faces, illuminated by the flickering lanterns. Sergeant Miller shouted orders, his voice taut with urgency. Shift weight right, slow the engine. Hold it there. Steel creaked and snapped audibly, but the tank did not fall, inch by agonizing inch. The crew managed to correct the balance, and the Sherman lurched forward, finally stabilizing at the center. Relief was palpable, but the danger was far from over. By midnight, it became evident that the barge had been transformed into a living test of endurance. It was no longer merely a vessel. It had become a crucible, weighing each man's courage and ingenuity against the immutable laws of physics. Lieutenant Harris observed the final Sherman prepare for the crossing, the largest, heaviest of them all, loaded with critical supplies, artillery and ammunition that the infantry desperately needed. On the far bank, engineers exchanged grim glances. The barge might not withstand this last load. The crew of the Sherman, inside themselves, felt the magnitude of the task. Every meter forward was a dialogue with danger, a negotiation with gravity and decay. The tank's engine roared in protest, shaking the hull and rattling instruments. Inside, engineers shouted instructions over the chaos, guiding the treads and monitoring stress points, improvising braces and ropes as needed. The air was thick with tension, and every man knew that a single miscalculation could spell catastrophe. And yet the Sherman moved forward slowly, deliberately, with the steady precision born of necessity and raw experience. At the river's midpoint, the barge began to groan ominously, sending a wave of fear through both crew and engineers. A plank cracked loudly under the Sherman's weight, splintering into jagged fragments. Harris held his breath, his hands clenched around the lantern, as he watched engineers rush to reinforce the deck with steel beams salvaged from the barge's weakened frame. The tank's treads were aligned perfectly over the most stable sections, but the slightest slip could undo hours of careful preparation. With meticulous coordination, the engineers stabilized the plank, and the Sherman inched forward another few meters, the tension in the air almost suffocating by the early hours of dawn. The impossible crossing had reached its climax. The final Sherman, inching towards the far bank, was a testament to human courage, ingenuity, and relentless determination. Every man involved felt the collective strain of hours of nerve-wracking danger, yet there was an unspoken understanding that they were part of something extraordinary. The river, the barge, and the tanks had become actors in a story of survival, one that would be recounted in hushed tones, around campfires and in post-war memoirs. Finally, as the first light of morning broke across the horizon, illuminating mist rising from the river, the final Sherman rolled onto solid ground. A collective exhale passed through the men, a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and exhilaration. The rusted barge, battered and scarred beyond recognition, had survived the ordeal, earning a place in the silent history of those who had dared the impossible. Engineers and soldiers alike paused, taking in the achievement, a feat that had seemed improbable at best and suicidal at worst, now completed by a combination of skill, courage, and indomitable will. Lieutenant Harris surveyed the scene, the line of Shermans, gleaming in the early morning light, and felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The operation had been more than a test of tanks and engineering. It had been a testament to human resilience. Every shudder of metal, every groan of wood, every measured step across the river had been a reminder that even in war, the ingenuity, courage, and determination of men could turn the impossible into reality. As the last engineers descended from the barge, brushing mud and sweat from their hands, Harris allowed himself a rare smile. The crossing was over, yet its impact would resonate. Far beyond the banks of the Rhine, it was a story of survival, a study in improvisation and a chronicle of bravery that would inspire those who understood the stakes and the sheer audacity required to succeed. Against the odds, the river was calm now, the barge resting heavily on the shore, and the Sherman stood like silent sentinels, symbols of victory over both circumstance and fear. As the morning sun rose fully over the river, casting long golden reflections across the water, the men finally allowed themselves to take stock of what had been achieved. The rested barge, scarred and battered beyond recognition, rested heavily on the far bank, having borne the weight of steel, men, and determination, far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The Sherman stood like silent sentinels, their engines now quiet, their treads marked with mud and water, each one a testament to human ingenuity and courage. It was a scene of quiet triumph, a moment that seemed to stretch beyond time itself. A reminder that in war, as in life, the impossible could be conquered with planning, skill, and unyielding will. Lieutenant Harris surveyed the crossing, his eyes tracing the path each Sherman had taken, the grooves in the wooden deck, the splintered planks, and the twisted steel braces that had saved them. Every man who had set foot on that barge and participated in something extraordinary, a feat that defied reason and mocked probability. It was not brute force alone that had carried them across the river, but the careful coordination of minds and hearts, working in harmony with machines and materials. The engineers, the crews, the soldiers on the banks, all had played a role in the story that had been told, again and again, long after the war had moved on. And yet beyond the mechanics and strategy, there was a deeper truth the crossing had revealed, the extraordinary capacity of human courage. When faced with uncertainty, it had been a lesson in patience, in improvisation, in trusting others and oneself. When the margin for error was razor thin, the Rhine had tested them. The barge had groaned under their weight, and the tanks had trembled with every step. But through it all, they had endured. They had crossed not just a river, but the boundary between doubt and achievement. As Harris finally turned to leave, he could hear the distant sounds of the infantry beginning to advance on the far bank, their movements now made possible by the Sherman tanks, delivered across that precarious, rusted vessel. In that moment, the crossing was no longer an isolated act. It was a turning point, a symbol of determination and ingenuity that had changed the course of a battle, and perhaps in some small way, the course of history itself.